Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the FIA Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I am attorney John Jablon, and with me is attorney Kendall Jackson, not the wine connoisseur, but, well, maybe a wine connoisseur. Kendall, how do you feel about wine?
It's shocking because I don't drink it at all. So I don't really, I'm totally not living up to it.
Okay, well, welcome anyway. Thanks for joining, even though you're a big liar. So today's episode, we're going to focus on PBMs. That's Pharmacy Benefit Managers. And they have been probably a hot topic for forever, right? I mean, there's always something going on with PBMs, and love them or hate them, they're here. And I know a lot of people do hate them, and some people love them, but more for convenience than the cost savings that many of them add. But that's neither here nor there. What we want to talk about today is some inquiries into PBMs that have been launched by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Now, PBMs are an integral part of every health plan, or most health plans, that is, but are they always a force for good? That is the central question. And according to the FTC, it looks like the answer that they found is no, not quite always a force for good, because like any other market, when there's only really a few big ones handling just about the entire market, some stuff is going to go awry. And that's what it looks like the FTC has found in this case. And this is all still ongoing, and there's some fun lawsuits and state law stuff going on. But ultimately today we want to talk about some of the legal aspects of what the FTC has found and what that means for self-funded health plans and the market in general. So to start, let's talk about how the top 6 PBMs account for 95% of prescriptions in the United States. 6 PBMs, 95% of prescriptions. Now, it may sound crazy, but let's break it down. Kendall, there are 3 big ones, right, that account for almost all of that. Who are they, and what's the rate, and what's going on with the allegations?
Yeah, so they referred to as the big 6 or those big 6 PBMs that really dominate the market. Like you said, 95% of the prescriptions in the US. And of those 6 are the big 3, and that's CVS, Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx. And they account for 80% of the total, which is a huge number. They're really dominating the market. So there's been a lot of lawsuits around these big 6 PBMs, and specifically those big 3, that have really alleged that these PBMs are inflating drug prices through various practices: unfair pricing, anti-competition practices, hidden fees, and non-transparent rebates. So things that really hinder health plans and negatively affect plan participants, but benefit those PBMs with very high profits. So things we see from them are a huge consolidation of the market in those 6 PBMs, like any other market, but really giving them a disproportionate power over this industry. And that's really just a direct result of horizontal consolidation and vertical integration. So horizontal consolidation being those big 6 accounting for most of the market. They've really eaten up smaller PBMs and grown in size. So we really just see those 6 as the main actors in this space. And then we have vertical integration, which means these PBMs have a hand in every part of this process. So they can operate their own mail order pharmacies, specialty pharmacies, retail pharmacies. When you think of CVS Caremark, one of the big 3, they have a massive empire of retail pharmacies. So it makes sense that they're going to want their patients as a PBM to go to those retail pharmacies to increase profits, and it really benefits them as a company. Another thing we see with vertical integration are being integrated with suppliers of goods and services, things like drug private labelers and provider groups. So they're really having a hand in each part of the process, and they have a lot of control over where the drug starts out being manufactured by the manufacturer all the way until it gets down to being prescribed to a member. And this just really incentivizes PBMs to increase utilization of affiliated pharmacies to generate large profits. And something that the Federal Trade Commission found was PBMs paid their own mail order pharmacies as much as 200 times more than the price at rival pharmacies. for commonly prescribed cancer drugs, which allowed them to bring in at least $1 billion in excess revenue, which not only increased costs to patients, but really shows how they're steering patients to their own pharmacies and obviously not favoring rival pharmacies in order to really, really up those prices and those profits.
Yeah, Kendall, it's so interesting, right? Because normally in this industry, we think about the cost to health plans and how health plans are negatively affected when folks like PBMs jack up prices for whatever reason. But one thing that sometimes just falls by the wayside is the consumer effect, right? I mean, when health plan expenses go up, consumer expenses go up as well. And that's one of the main reasons that the FTC is looking into all this stuff. It's not because they care so much that health plans and health insurance are getting gouged. Nobody cares about that. The federal government has proven that at every opportunity for years and years, but it's really about consumers and the effect that the market share and these market factors have on the ultimate consumer. Because when a health plan pays more, they need to charge individual consumers more. And that's when it becomes a problem. So it's interesting that, I don't think that the PBMs are doing this and saying, patients are going to have to pay more. That's what we want. No, that's not what. It's just an unintended effect. When you make more money, the money's got to come from somewhere, and health plans don't have unlimited money. That's that's the reason that fiat exists, because health plans have a need to save money. And of course, our ultimate goal is to help health plans conserve costs and also help ordinary hardworking Americans pay less for health insurance. And these types of actions by PBMs and other players in the industry, they do neither of those things. They work directly against everything that many of you listening, probably, well, maybe even all of you, are actively working day to day to avoid. So it's really a trickle-down effect. And Kendall, before you mentioned rebates, and rebates are a huge hot button issue for the FTC as well as for many of you listening. I can't tell you how many times we've reviewed client agreements and they talk about rebates and they treat them in interesting ways, and people have a lot of issues with that. A lot of folks in the industry feel, and probably rightly so, that rebates gotten as the result of a PBM contract should go to the employer because it's the employer paying for the drugs. And so rebates it follows the natural progression of the money, that if you pay for the drugs, if money goes back, well, it should go to you. And there are a lot of PBMs, a lot of admittedly small PBMs that take that same stance. And they say, look, we are completely transparent about our rebates. If there's a rebate, it goes 100% to the employer, period. We recognize that this should be your money. And employers and brokers and TPAs really appreciate that. But the big three, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx, tend to not take that stance, according to the FTC. Generally, there's a lot of confusion regarding rebates in the contracts, and a lot of it is very much non-transparent, and really opaque is the word that is often used to describe situations like that. And the problem arises when the rebates are opaque and when the PBM takes a portion of it, because when you are going to keep some of the rebate, you have an incentive to increase the rebate. And the way to increase the rebate is to increase how much is paid. Are you seeing the problem? If PBMs pay more, it increases rebates and it's more money in their pockets. So there's every incentive, according to the FTC, to pay more for drugs because you can literally pocket more money if you pay more money. It's kind of ironic, but because it's not actually your money, right? When you're passing the costs along, who cares? Is sort of the general feeling there. And that is, in the FTC's mind and in the mind of hopefully most of you listening here, that's a big problem. So there's some lawsuits about that. There's the FTC investigation that is revealing more and more about that all the time. And there's so much more than just rebates. And Kendall, you mentioned some of it, but do you want to go into detail about some of the other stuff that's happening as a result of the market consolidation and the influence? I mean, there's more about rebates, but there's also lots of stuff about how they contract with various entities and spread pricing and just tons of fun stuff.
So one thing I guess we sadly see from the sort of domination that these big six and specifically the big three have over this industry is that a lot of independent, smaller pharmacies, they struggle to really compete with the pricing and reimbursement terms that are set by PBMs, which often leads to closures and reduced access to medications in certain communities. So the FTC study actually found that around 10% of rural independent retail pharmacies closed between 2013 and 2022. And 10% might not seem like a lot for around 10 years of time, but it really is significant when you think about the effect that it's having on small business owners and also just patients directly. If a patient's in a rural or a medically underserved area where a local pharmacy may be their only option for getting necessary medications, this has a huge impact on them. They won't have access to Fluvex or EpiPens or things that are really necessary for their health because these independent pharmacies couldn't really compete with these larger PBMs. There's also a lot of allegations around anti-competitive practices for PBMs, and there's a whole host of them. And I guess we'll just address a few of them. But one of the major ones is going to be exclusionary contracting. So this happens when PBMs create exclusive contracts with specific pharmacies or manufacturers, which really limits competition and will steer patients to PBM affiliated partners. And what happens is this really just reduces consumer choice. PBMs can get potential kickbacks from this, which obviously makes them want to do this exclusionary contracting. And like I mentioned earlier, that the side effect of this is also that it can drive smaller pharmacies out of the market, which is really unfortunate. And we see this happening because, like John said earlier, these big three account for 80% of the market here. So it's really huge. PBMs, we also see them securing larger rebates being a big thing that John just mentioned, but we see them securing larger rebates from drug manufacturers in exchange for preferential formulary placement. This is sort of known as rebate walls. And what really happens is this excludes lower cost generics from formularies in order to have higher overall drug costs for plans and patients. So it's beneficial for the PBM to have very expensive brand name drugs on their formulary rather than a lower cost generic, because they're obviously going to make more profit from that. It's definitely more beneficial for the PBM in that stance. John, you want to talk a little about the other ones that we have for anti-competitive practices?
Yeah, well, I think you hit on really the big stuff. I think actually it might make sense to talk about some of the state law stuff going on and how states are looking to regulate this. And I think this also gives some insight into what they're seeing, just because, states don't take action unless they perceive problems generally. For one thing, in Oregon, depending on where you are in the country. Here in the Northeast, we say Oregon, but I know that that's not actually correct. But anyway, the legislature in that state is attempting to require PBMs to register with the state and disclose detailed information about their drug prices and rebates and their spread pricing practices. And that's really, really interesting because registering with the state alone is not necessarily dispositive of anything, right? I mean, you can register whatever you want with the state. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow any particular practices. And we've seen that in lots of states and even with the federal government, where the requirement to register, it just keeps a record. It doesn't actually change anything. I do think that they're looking into that, and the registration process is more an attempt to gather information and also make sure that at least PBMs are complying with their own written policies or their registered policies anyway than anything else. And as another example, my former home state, New York, requires PBMs to disclose rebate amounts and the percentage of the rebates that are passed on to health plans, which also in theory requires them to disclose the amount of rebates that they are keeping as PBMs. So it's another interesting aspect, and New York loves to do this. They like to put sort of vague language in requiring people to act in the best interests of health plans and their beneficiaries. And, the law is a bit more specific than that, or the law that is passed already. And I know that there's other stuff going on in their pipeline, but I honestly have no idea if it's going to come to fruition. But New York law currently requires PBMs to act in the best interests of health plans and beneficiaries, which is really designed to reduce conflicts of interest, right? Because as Kendall was talking about, PBMs are sort of acting on both sides of the equation here. And in order to reduce conflicts of interest, transparency is key. And acting in the best interests of health plans, one of the main tenets of that is going to be transparency. And that's what a lot of states, including New York and Oregon, are trying to do right now. As another example, Arkansas passed a law that regulates PBM reimbursement rates. It sets a floor. It actually says that your reimbursement rates to pharmacies have to be at most a certain amount, and it's usually based on cost. And that law was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that the law is okay. It is okay that Arkansas regulates the PBM reimbursement rates. So that was a huge win for Arkansas there, and frankly, consumers are going to benefit in the long run as well. And then in relation to the federal government, there's something that's proposed in the Senate. I don't know if it's gotten a whole lot of traction yet. If only Brady were here, I think he knows every bill and status off the top of his head. But it's proposed something called the Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act. Just more word salad and alphabet soup, I guess. It would require PBMs to disclose rebates and pass a huge portion of those rebates directly onto consumers, which is really interesting. I don't know if that is entirely realistic, but it's a step in the right direction for sure. And who knows what might change in the long run, and hopefully it can get some support. And then there's a bipartisan Lower Healthcare Cost Act, the LHCCA, which would require PBMs to report data on pricing and rebate practices directly to HHS, which is of course designed for accountability and informed policymaking. So it's basically the federal government admitting that we need more information because we want to do some stuff in the legislative capacity, but we need more information to do it. So a law requiring reporting is a great way to do that, rather than sort of asking very nicely for reporting, which just is not going to happen. So that would be fantastic as well. And Kendall, I know that you have some information about a congressional hearing that was pretty recent, right? About a week ago?
Yeah, it was about a week ago on July 23rd. This is huge. It just really shows that there's a lot of buzz about this. And it's good to see, like you just mentioned, a few states really taking action on this and putting legislation in place. And as far as it goes in the federal landscape, there's been a lot of different bills that have sort of stalled. They've either passed the Senate or passed the House, but really haven't gone much further than that. So that's really what the conversation was about at this congressional hearing, was the different bills that we see trying to regulate PBMs and sort of have increased competition and transparency in that industry. But there, the members of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability really blamed the PBM industry for raising drug prices and running independent, smaller pharmacies out of business. And the executives from the big three were there, from CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx. And they were arguing that they, as PBMs, are the ones lowering prices for drugs and supporting local pharmacies, which, from all the things we recently discussed, we haven't really seen be the case, but this is what they're saying that they do. And they pass the blame for the high cost of drugs onto the manufacturers, which they claim have the sole pricing power. From their opinion, they think that PBMs are the ones reducing prices for the health plans and employers. And the lawmakers directly went back and said that there's a lot of lack of transparency from PBMs because they use complicated money-making structures, like we mentioned earlier, with the vertical integration, with having their hands in each sort of piece of this process. Things can get very convoluted and some things can fly under the radar. So things can get a little hairy and not be very transparent, which allows PBMs to do all of these things that don't really benefit health plans or the patients. So allegedly, the FTC is preparing to file suits against the big three. So we will see what comes from that. It's yet to actually been filed, but I guess there's just going to be more to come on this topic. The FTC first launched their inquiry into the big six and specifically the big three back in 2022. So we're years in the making on this, and the findings of the inquiry only came out recently. And some of the PBMs actually didn't even participate in submitting their data. So we will see. Hopefully we get some more information about their practices and we really hold these guys accountable.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Thanks so much, Kendall. And as always, the FIA Group will provide updates, if or hopefully when this suit gets filed. I mean, one way or the other, it would be great to know what's really going on and see what happens here. So stay tuned for that, because we will definitely be on top of it. And that does it for us for today. On behalf of Kendall and myself, thank you so much for listening. And as always, if you are an ICE client, feel free to reach out to us if you want to talk about this or anything else, or if you want to vent about your PBM or anything else. We are happy to listen, and in a way, we're contractually required to listen. But really, we are happy to. And thanks again for tuning in, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks so much.